In the limestone walls of Chateau Gallard, once considered the most impregnable fortress in medieval Europe, a small opening barely 2 feet wide changed the course of history. What appears to be a simple architectural feature was actually a calculated vulnerability that French soldiers exploited in 1204, bringing down King Richard the Lionheart's greatest stronghold through its toilet shaft. The absence of proper sanitation facilities in medieval castles was not always an oversight or sign of primitive living conditions. Castle architects deliberately designed fortifications without adequate toilets as part of sophisticated defensive strategies that prioritized military function over human comfort. These decisions reflected a medieval worldview where survival during siege warfare outweighed the daily inconveniences of inadequate sanitation. The strategic omission of toilets, or their careful placement in vulnerable positions, reveals how medieval military engineers approached the fundamental tension between fortress security and human necessity. Every opening in a castle wall represented a potential weakness that enemies could exploit, and toilet shafts provided some of the most accessible entry points for determined attackers. Medieval toilets, called privies or garderobes, were usually built into the walls so that they projected out on corbels and any waste fell below and into the castle moat. This design created an immediate architectural problem for defensive planners. Each garderobe required an external shaft that penetrated the castle's protective barrier, creating what military engineers recognized as structural vulnerabilities. The protruding shaft of masonry that made up the toilet was buttressed from below, or might nest in the junction between a tower and wall. While these buttresses provided structural support, they also created climbing opportunities for attackers. The external nature of garderobe shafts meant that enemies could observe their locations during reconnaissance, mapping potential entry routes before launching assaults. Castle architects faced competing demands when designing sanitation systems. Occupants needed facilities for basic human functions, but every toilet shaft weakened the fortress's defensive integrity. The solution often involved limiting the number of toilets to absolute minimum requirements, forcing inhabitants to share facilities or rely on portable alternatives like chamber pots. The term garderobe itself reveals medieval attitudes toward these spaces. Originally meaning wardrobe, occupants would hang their clothing in these shafts because ammonia, a byproduct of excretion, would protect visitors' coats and cloaks from moths or fleas. This dual function made garderobes valuable storage spaces that castle dwellers were reluctant to abandon entirely, despite their security risks. But the defensive concerns went beyond simple structural vulnerabilities. The most dramatic example of toilet-based castle infiltration occurred in 1203-4, when besiegers used just such a latrine shaft to gain entry to Chateau Gallard on the River Seine in France, built by Richard I. This incident became a cautionary tale that influenced castle design across medieval Europe. French forces under Philip Augustus had surrounded the supposedly impregnable fortress, but conventional siege methods proved ineffective against Richard's innovative architectural defenses. The castle's position on a rocky outcrop above the Seine River, combined with its advanced concentric design, made direct assault nearly impossible. Traditional siege engines could not breach the walls, and the garrison seemed capable of withstanding a prolonged blockade. The breakthrough came when French soldiers discovered that the castle's garderobe shaft was large enough to allow human passage. Under cover of darkness, a small group of attackers climbed up through the waste chute, emerging inside the castle's defenses. Once inside, they could open gates and lower drawbridges to admit the main assault force. After the siege, to ensure no repeat of the trick, a masonry wall was built around the shaft exit. This retrofitted defense became standard practice, but the damage to the castle's reputation was irreversible. Word of the toilet-based infiltration spread throughout medieval Europe, alerting military engineers to the specific vulnerabilities created by sanitation systems. The incident demonstrated that even the most sophisticated fortifications could be compromised through seemingly minor architectural details. Castle designers began reconsidering whether toilet facilities were worth the security risk they created. Following the Chateau Gallard incident, many castle architects deliberately limited toilet facilities to reduce potential entry points for attackers. This approach forced inhabitants to adapt their daily routines around shared facilities and alternative sanitation methods. Some castles concentrated their toilets in specific areas, such as Dover Castle, built in the second half of the 11th century, had a cesspit at the base of one wall of the keep to collect waste from the toilets above. By centralizing sanitation in single locations, architects could focus defensive measures on fewer vulnerable points while still providing necessary facilities. The concentration strategy also allowed for better monitoring of potential security breaches. Guards could observe centralized toilet areas more effectively than scattered individual facilities throughout the castle. Any suspicious activity around toilet shafts would be immediately visible to defenders manning nearby positions. Alternative arrangements emerged to minimize external vulnerabilities. Ground floor toilets with internal drainage systems eliminated the need for external shafts entirely. There were also toilets in ground floor buildings, and these had stone drainage channels to drain away waste. These internal systems were more difficult for attackers to exploit, though they created different challenges for waste management and odor control. Chamber pots became essential equipment in castles with limited toilet facilities. The castle's lord often had a private latrine, but even he had, like everyone else, a chamber pot if needed. These portable solutions allowed inhabitants to meet basic needs without accessing potentially vulnerable toilet locations during times of heightened security. But the defensive considerations extended beyond simple entry point management. Castle architects understood that inadequate sanitation facilities could serve as psychological weapons during siege warfare. Defenders forced to use limited toilet facilities experienced increased stress and discomfort that could weaken their resolve over extended periods. The strategic limitation of toilets created hierarchical access systems that reinforced social structures during sieges. The castle's priest might also be one of the lucky few to have an ensuite toilet for his own chamber, as at Northampton Castle, England, built in the late 11th century. Priority access to sanitation facilities became a marker of status and importance within the castle's defensive organization. Common soldiers and servants faced the greatest inconvenience from limited toilet facilities, but this hardship was considered acceptable if it improved overall defensive capabilities. The discomfort of shared or distant toilets was viewed as a necessary sacrifice for military security, part of the broader pattern of prioritizing collective defense over individual comfort. The psychological impact extended to attackers as well. Besieging forces knew that castles with limited sanitation facilities would eventually face internal pressures that could lead to surrender. The absence of adequate toilets became part of the broader siege strategy, contributing to the gradual degradation of defender morale. Medieval military manuals began incorporating advice about toilet-related siege tactics, both for attackers seeking to exploit these vulnerabilities and defenders trying to minimize their impact. The previously private matter of castle sanitation became a recognized element of military engineering. Some castle architects developed specialized solutions like triangular urinals built into some tower walls so that defenders did not have to leave their posts for very long. These innovations reflected sophisticated thinking about balancing human needs with defensive requirements. An example is found in the mural passage at Orford Castle in Suffolk, England, built in the second half of the 12th century. The placement of urinals within wall passages meant that defenders could relieve themselves without exposing themselves to enemy observation or creating additional external vulnerabilities. The urinal system addressed one of the practical challenges of limited toilet facilities by providing quick access alternatives for male defenders. Guards manning battlements or towers could use these facilities without abandoning their positions for extended periods, maintaining better defensive coverage during critical moments. At Castle Rising in Norfolk, England, built in the mid-12th century, there are two toilets next to each other but in separate rooms, one with a toilet and one with a urinal, which might perhaps be evidence of a separation of the sexes. This arrangement suggests that even with limited facilities, castle designers considered gender-specific needs while maintaining security priorities. The urinal innovation demonstrated how medieval engineers could address human necessities through creative architectural solutions that minimized defensive vulnerabilities. These designs influenced castle construction across Europe as architects shared knowledge about effective defensive sanitation systems. The deliberate limitation of toilet facilities created significant health challenges for castle inhabitants. Poor sanitation contributed to disease outbreaks that could devastate defending forces more effectively than enemy siege engines. Castle toilets stank to high heaven and required regular cleaning through a simple bucket of water thrown down the shaft or by diverting the wastewater from the kitchen sinks. Limited facilities meant that cleaning and maintenance became more difficult, exacerbating hygiene problems. Henry III of England famously complained about sanitation problems, ordering that another privy chamber to be made, and such more fitting and proper place even if it should cost £100. Royal discomfort with inadequate facilities highlights how even the most powerful castle inhabitants suffered from security-driven sanitation limitations. The concentration of waste from multiple users in centralized facilities created breeding grounds for disease-carrying pests and bacteria. Castle inhabitants faced increased risk of dysentery, typhoid, and other waste-related illnesses that could incapacitate defenders during critical siege periods. Medical understanding of sanitation-related disease transmission remained limited in medieval times, but practical experience taught castle dwellers about the health consequences of poor toilet facilities. The tension between defensive security and public health became an ongoing challenge for castle administrators. Some castles attempted to address health concerns through improved waste management systems, but these solutions often conflicted with defensive priorities. Better sanitation typically required more complex infrastructure that created additional security vulnerabilities. Limited toilet facilities reinforced medieval social hierarchies within castle communities. Access to better sanitation became a privilege that marked social status and military importance. The chamber of the castle's lord often had a private latrine, while common inhabitants shared communal facilities or relied on chamber pots. This differential access created visible markers of social stratification that extended to the most basic human functions. Noble visitors and high-ranking military officers received priority access to the best available toilet facilities, while servants, soldiers, and craftsmen used whatever remained available. During siege conditions, these hierarchies became more pronounced as stress and scarcity intensified competition for limited resources. The social politics of toilet access influenced castle life in subtle but significant ways. Marriage alliances, political negotiations, and military appointments could be affected by the quality of sanitation facilities available to different social groups within the castle community. Castle administrators needed to balance social expectations with defensive requirements when allocating toilet access. Providing adequate facilities for important guests and officials was essential for maintaining political relationships, but too many high-quality toilets created security vulnerabilities that could compromise the entire fortress. The waste management hierarchy extended to the disposal and cleaning of sanitation facilities. Lower-status inhabitants typically handled the unpleasant task of emptying chamber pots and cleaning toilet shafts, creating occupational divisions based on proximity to human waste. As siege warfare techniques evolved, castle architects developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to the toilet security problem. These innovations reflected growing understanding of how sanitation systems could be designed to minimize defensive vulnerabilities. Some later medieval castles incorporated internal waste management systems that eliminated external shafts entirely. These designs used sophisticated drainage networks that channel waste through internal passages to collection points within the castle walls, reducing opportunities for enemy infiltration. The development of improved masonry techniques allowed architects to create smaller, more defensible toilet openings that maintained functionality while reducing security risks. Advanced stone-cutting tools enabled the construction of toilet shafts too narrow for human passage but adequate for waste disposal. Defensive innovations included the installation of iron gratings, turning passages, and trap mechanisms in toilet shafts. These obstacles made infiltration attempts more difficult and dangerous while preserving the facility's primary sanitation functions. The evolution of castle toilet design paralleled broader changes in medieval military architecture. As siege engines became more powerful and assault techniques more sophisticated, every aspect of castle design required reconsideration from defensive perspectives. By the late medieval period, some castles achieved sophisticated balance between sanitation needs and security requirements through careful architectural planning and advanced construction techniques. However, many fortifications continued to prioritize defense over comfort, maintaining the principle that military security justified significant inconvenience for inhabitants. The willingness to sacrifice sanitation comfort for defensive security reflected the medieval fortress mentality that prioritized collective survival over individual convenience. This mindset shaped not only toilet design but broader approaches to castle living. Castle inhabitants accepted that their daily lives would be constrained by defensive requirements. Limited toilet facilities were part of a broader pattern of restrictions that included regulated movement, restricted access to certain areas, and constant awareness of security protocols. The fortress mentality extended to visitors and guests who had to adapt to castle's defensive priorities. Even noble visitors found themselves using inadequate sanitation facilities when security concerns outweighed hospitality considerations. Training and preparation for siege conditions included instruction on managing with limited toilet facilities. Castle inhabitants learned to modify their eating, drinking, and sleeping patterns to accommodate restricted sanitation access during periods of heightened alert. The psychological adaptation to fortress living included accepting that normal standards of comfort and privacy would be suspended when military necessity demanded it. Toilet-related inconveniences were viewed as minor hardships compared to the catastrophic consequences of defensive failure. This mentality influenced medieval attitudes toward privacy, hygiene, and social interaction in ways that extended beyond castle walls. The fortress approach to living shaped broader cultural patterns about individual rights versus collective security that influenced medieval society generally. The medieval practice of limiting castle toilets for defensive purposes established principles that influenced military architecture for centuries. The fundamental tension between human needs and security requirements continued to shape fortress design long after the medieval period ended. Modern military installations still grapple with similar challenges when balancing operational security with personnel comfort. The medieval precedent of accepting sanitation inconveniences for defensive advantages provided historical justification for continued prioritization of security over comfort in military contexts. The architectural innovations developed to address toilet security problems contributed to broader advances in medieval engineering and construction techniques. Solutions for defensive sanitation challenges required sophisticated understanding of structural engineering, drainage systems, and military tactics. The social hierarchies that emerged around toilet access in medieval castles reflected broader patterns of how societies organized resources during crisis conditions. The precedent of differential access to basic facilities based on social status and military importance influenced emergency planning approaches in later historical periods. The evidence reveals that medieval castle architects made deliberate choices to limit toilet facilities as part of comprehensive defensive strategies. These decisions reflected sophisticated understanding of how human necessities could be weaponized in siege warfare. The discomfort and inconvenience experienced by castle inhabitants was not an unintended consequence of primitive technology, but a calculated trade-off that prioritized fortress security over daily comfort. Medieval engineers understood that every convenience came with defensive cost that had to be carefully weighed against military benefits. The toilet shaft at Chateau Galard serves as a permanent reminder that even the most basic human needs could become vulnerabilities in the harsh mathematics of medieval warfare. The French soldiers who climbed through that waste chute demonstrated how thoroughly medieval military thinking had penetrated every aspect of fortress design. In the shadow of castle walls across Europe, the absence of adequate toilets tells a story of societies that chose survival over comfort, security over convenience, and collective defense over individual dignity. These empty spaces where toilets might have been built represent one of medieval warfare's most intimate and unsettling calculations, that human discomfort was an acceptable price for defensive advantage. The medieval castle toilet, or its deliberate absence, remains a testament to how completely the fortress mentality could reshape the most basic aspects of daily life, turning even the most private human functions into instruments of war.